Hey folks, as part of my work on a resistance history of the United States and applying its lessons to today, I've had to revisit the Constitution, haven't we all? Not because it was a product of resistance, though, but because some parts of it were shaped by organized opposition that was strong enough to extract concessions from authority. There are important elements of resistance in forcing concessions, and we need to understand that. But that first requires getting honest about what that authority that they were pushing against was trying to achieve. Most people still treat the Constitution as the natural endpoint of the Revolutionary War. Its fulfillment, the capstone of whatever that struggle was supposed to mean, the fulfillment of the spirit of '76. But that interpretation skips the part where power reorganizes itself, maybe even, as Gerald Horne has mentioned, a counter-revolution, and that term is worth unpacking. But what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 wasn't the triumph of liberty. It was a calculated act of political control, a strategic consolidation of authority in the hands of a few nationalists. And nowhere was that more violent, more enduring, or more revealing about the country we were and the country we have become than in what the Constitution did with slavery. So let's talk about that. And, of course, as always, we start with busting a few myths. There was no dramatic standoff over slavery at the convention. No crisis that nearly broke the Union. No impassioned moral divide. That is a nationalist fantasy drafted after the fact, immediately after the fact, to justify what they agreed to make them, and their historians, feel morally better about the whole thing. Invent a dispute, and then insert in one of the days that Hamilton bothered to show up to the convention. The truth is simpler and more damning, as it almost always is. There was consensus, cloaked in euphemism, sealed by silence, and justified with political math, white political math. When slavery came up, it came up carefully, referred to as other persons, persons held to service or labor, or such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. The word slave appears nowhere, which is something that the nationalist proponents of this love to trot out. Well, that's on purpose, to protect the framers' fragile sensibilities and hope that maybe history would therefore not notice and give them a pass, which is exactly what it's done. But enslaved people shape the document in unmistakable ways, so we have to put them back in. Take the 3/5 clause, Article 1, Section 2. It wasn't a debate about the morality of slavery. It was a fight over representation. Southern delegates wanted enslaved people to count toward their population total so they could gain more seats in the House and more electoral votes, without granting those people any rights. Northern delegates balked, not out of principle, but out of concern for the balance of power, the compromise in which the Northern delegates just caved. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of one free person, not for their sake, but for the sake of giving their enslavers more influence. That clause didn't restrain slavery. It made it politically profitable and alone ensured that it would persist long into the future, no matter what the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky has to say about it. Maybe he should pray on it. That was repealed by the 14th Amendment as a result of the Civil War. Or we could look at the Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2. It required states, even free states, to return enslaved people who had declared their own independence and crossed state lines. It gave enslavers a constitutional claim to human property beyond their own borders. Under the British Empire, under the imperial framework, no such universal enforcement mandate had existed. But the Constitution, under the new federal government, created one. It didn't ask, it ordered. It made slave catching a national responsibility. There was no choice, as Madison wrote in Federalist 54. The law, in some states, treated them as property, so the federal Constitution had to treat them as property too. It's a hell of a leap, little Jimmy. Because some states treated people as property, all states had to treat people as property for the purposes of returning that property to their owners. That was changed by the 13th Amendment as a result of the Civil War. There's a theme here. Then there's the clause on the slave trade. This is the clause that actually generated the most debate. This is the one that supposedly pointed toward abolition, and which is what this regime's interpretation says, the 1776 Commission report. But in fact, it did the opposite. Article 1, Section 9. It prohibited Congress from banning the international slave trade for 20 years, till 1808. It was not a sunset clause. It was a gag rule. They just couldn't do it before 1808. Not to be confused with the other gag rule. May 1836, when the House of Representatives passed a resolution banning even the consideration of any petition relating to slavery without hearing them. So no talk about ending the slave trade until 1808, and no talk about ending slavery after 1836. But back to 1787. The debates around the slave trade clause were telling. So George Mason, who gets a lot of credit here, is one of the few who spoke against the trade, and he did condemn slavery in those discussions. He expressed concern about what the continued importation of Africans would do to white people, to moral degradation, the potential for rebellion. Always afraid of black people are these guys. And the instability of flooding the labor market of people. He had already made his money from slavery. Now he's worried about its efficiency. When Congress finally did ban the international slave trade in 1808, it wasn't fulfilling the Constitution's higher purpose. It was responding to the fact that enslavers had shifted strategy. They didn't need ships, they had auctions. The internal slave trade, now centered in the Upper South, particularly Virginia, where people became more valuable than tobacco had been. That new slave trade from there to the New Southwest was faster, cheaper, and better suited to the demand for cotton labor. The Constitution hadn't ended slavery. Didn't even think about it. But in preserving and strengthening it, the Constitution did allow slavery to evolve. What's most striking about all this is not what was said. It's about what wasn't said. Slavery was not a dominant subject of debate. It wasn't even a source of serious contention. Now, there are specific clauses relating to slavery that were debated, and those discussions, centered on power, representation, and property interests, not on human rights, certainly not on abolition. There were more recorded speeches at the convention about paper money than about human bondage, and that extends exponentially when you get into the ratifying conventions. No one walked out over it. Franklin raised no objection, or rather, because he wouldn't read any of his own statements during the convention, he had nobody else read them, his objection for him. Washington said nothing, but that's Washington, right? I mean, he was there to say nothing that he wasn't told to say. He presided. Madison managed the floor. He's just interested in centralized government coming out of it, and he doesn't care how, and Hamilton just has his own priorities. And those delegates who refused to sign, people like Elbridge Gerry and George Mason and Edmund Randolph, even Luther Martin, did so over the lack of a Bill of Rights and the fear of federal overreach, not because slavery was embedded into the structure of the new government. It was not a deal breaker at any point. So when people say that the protection of slavery was a necessary evil to ensure the formation of the Union, all they're doing is repeating a justification that the nationalists themselves invented, the framers themselves invented, because they knew it looked bad. But it was never a binary, right? The Articles of Confederation still existed. There was a United States before the Constitutional Convention. If this Constitution had failed, as even Madison admitted, they would have just called another convention and tried again. There would have continued to have been a United States. All of this was a political arrangement, a particular political arrangement, and at no point a moral or other kind of inevitability. But white Americans, then and now, and their allies, have been astonishingly willing to trade another 80 years of legally sanctioned oppression and brutality for the sake of Just what exactly? Here's the question for you. Was the trade-off worth it? For what? For a political instrument that could have been different? For the Electoral College? For the brilliance of 3 branches of government? They could have just tried again. As they themselves admitted. Trade another 80 years for that. Generations in bondage. The myth that slavery was regrettable but unavoidable remains one of the most powerful fictions in American public history. And if we're going to commemorate 250 years of this country honestly, that fiction has to go. The Constitution didn't sidestep slavery. It structured it in and strengthened it and enabled it to evolve into something even more awful. And the fact that most people still don't know that or aren't supposed to is part of the story too. But we're here to tell it, and we're here to talk about it.